If a tree falls on your opponent and no one's around to hear them, do they make a sound? Hey everyone, it's Blake. I'm the Highlander hipster, bringing you another budget brew today, Modern Horizons 3 edition. I found a few more commanders that I kind of like from this set, but with Bloombarrow fast approaching, I'm going to shift my focus towards that. So you're going to be seeing some more Bloombarrow commanders coming up in this series very soon. Obviously, I'll have to wait till prices settle down just a little bit because pre-release and pre-order prices are obviously going to be a little bit too far out of our budget range. But today here on Budget Brews, we do $25 deck brews around commanders that I think are cool and interesting and generally underutilized. And today I'm coming to you today with Yoti Moag Ancient. He's a 2/4 for 2 blue and a green, legendary creature elemental. When he enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 green forest dryad land creature token for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. At the beginning of each combat, land creatures you control get +X till end of turn, where X is Yoti's power. So he's a pretty cool little commander. He's 4 mana, 2 bodies, a 2/4, and a 1/1 land creature. He even turns the land creature into a 3/3 for you on your combat. But obviously that's not enough by itself to win you the game or create a massive advantage. So what are we looking to do? Well, obviously our commander looks like he wants land creatures specifically. So it looks like we want to get more lands and creatures into play and land creatures into play. So that way we can push damage and work on killing our opponents. Now, I'm assuming that most people would think that the first thing you'd start moving into are man lands, which are essentially lands that can turn into creatures. Generally, these are very inefficient in terms of the size of the creature you get in reconcile with the power and toughness that it offers you. They're generally pretty inefficient because they're lands. They're supposed to be mostly for mana, but the fact that they can turn into creatures can be very powerful in 1v1 formats, but they're just far too inefficient for commander's purposes. Now, there are still worth running in case you flood out or run out of things to do. So I still have a few of those, but what our actual main focus is and what we're going to be able to convert our deck's game plan into a win condition with are cards that turn all of our lands into creatures. And there's not a ton of cards that do that in Magic, but there's a few that are very powerful for what we're trying to do. Root Awakening and Sylvan Awakening in particular. Root Awakening is 4 and a green for a sorcery. Choose one, untap all lands you control, or until end of turn, lands you control become 2/2 creatures. They're still lands, and you can entwine it for 2 and a green, which means you do both modes. So for 8 mana, you untap all your lands and make them 2/2s. Sylvan Awakening is very similar. It's 2 and a green for a sorcery until next turn. All lands you control become 2/2 elemental creatures with reach, indestructible, and haste. They're still lands. So Sylvan Awakening's cheaper, gives you some extra keywords to make it sure your lands don't die and can play a little defense, but also doesn't really get you the mana back. The lands that you tap to cast the Sylvan Awakening are not then going to be able to be useful to be attackers or blockers. Now, the blocker side of Sylvan Awakening is not really what we're looking for. We're really looking to use these to be finishers, but I guess it's nice that it's there. There are a few more things that I found on a budget that could turn lands into creatures that I felt like were worth running. So Embodiment of Insight, Kamal's Will, and Joriel, a Voice of Zhalfir. Embodiment of Insight's kind of a weird one. It's 4 and a green for a 4/4 with Vigilance. It's an elemental. Land creatures you control have Vigilance. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may have target land you control become a 3/3 elemental creature with haste until end of turn. It's still a land. So very nice. That's actually a pretty sizable land creature. So it can definitely tango with our commander out. It'll be a 5/5. And also you can tap it for mana on your second main since it has Vigilance. So very nice. Kamal's Will is 3 and a green for an instant. Choose one. If you control your commander, you get both of these. Until end of turn, any number of target lands you control become 1/1 elemental creatures with Vigilance, Indestructible, and Haste. Sound familiar? Choose target creature you don't control. Each creature you control deals damage equal to its power to that creature. So obviously the main thing we're focused here is on the first mode. It's a pretty inefficient way to turn our lands all into creatures, but nonetheless, it's a hard effect to come by, so we're happy to have it. And then if we have our commander out, which we most likely will want to if we're casting this card, we can essentially kill one of our opponent's creatures. So that's pretty nice. Joriel, Voice of Zhalfir, is 2 green and a blue for a 3/3 human druid. At the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 target land you control becomes an XX green, blue, and green bird creature token with flying, not token, becomes a bird creature with flying and haste until end of turn. Where X is the number of cards in your hand, it's still a land. Whenever a land creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Okay, that's pretty nice. Gives us probably a fairly large flying creature to spot us a card. And then if any of our other little land creatures can hit people, then they get us extra cards. Very nice, very useful. And then we have one more, and this is kind of going to bridge the gap into our next topic. We have Kamal, Fist of Krosa. 4 green, green for a 4/3 human druid. You can pay a green, target land becomes a 1/1 creature until end of turn. It's still a land. 2 green, green, green. Creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. So obviously this card is a pretty expensive creature to be able to turn our lands into creatures. But the one really powerful thing that our commander has going on for it is it double dips on overruns. And by what I mean by that is if we use Kamal's second ability, say we have a 1/1, just say we have our commander and the 1/1 that it makes. We activate Kamal's second ability. Yoti and the token will get +3/+3 in trample, right? So I have a 5/7 Yoti, no 5. I can do math. Yeah, 5/7 Yoti and a 4/4 land creature token, right? Then we go to combat. Then Yoti triggers, and he's going to pump the land creature by his power. So he's going to pump it by 5. So you can see how this can exponentially increase very quickly. And the fact that Kamal can kind of double dip here, he can also spot us some land creatures that can get super buffed by his ability and Yoti's ability, is definitely a really good way to convert our land creatures into win conditions. And he's not the only overrun that we're running. Obviously, he's the best one because he's the one that also can make land creatures and get that ball rolling too. But I found a few more overruns that were worth using. Thunderfoot Baloth is 4 green green for a 5/5 with trample. As long as you control your commander, it gets +2/+2, and other creatures you control get +2/+2 and trample. So it's a pretty decent threat on its own, and then once again it gives the trample, which is very important for us, and it will double dip with our commander. And the Return of the Wild Speaker, this one's kind of like a modal card. It's 4 and a green for an instant. Draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, or each non-human creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. So for me, the way that I look at this is we don't really want to be stuck with an overrun in our hand because it doesn't do anything until we're like pretty ready to close the game. So I really like having the out of being able to draw at least a few cards from this. We don't have like a bunch of huge creatures lying around where we're going to be drawing like 8+ cards off this thing consistently. But just being able to cycle this for like 3 or 4 cards is more than fine. And then when we need an overrun, this will be very useful. +3/+3 is a very sizable chunk. So next we're going to move into a few more ways to augment our commander's power that I've found work with the strategy very well. So first up, the best one is Blackblade Reforged. It's a 2-mana legendary artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each land you control. It equips to a legendary creature for 3 or any other creature for 7. So obviously this can make your commander enormous, and then all of your land creatures become like must deal with threats. Like all of them are gonna be, who knows, like 12/12s, 20/20s, whatever. Especially when you see how many lands we're going to be putting into play later. Retreat to Kazandu is 2 and a green for an enchantment. It has Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you choose one. Put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control, or you can gain 2 life. Good survivability, really reliable enchantment that's going to stick on the board and be very effective for us. We're not necessarily what I would consider a landfall deck. We put a lot of lands into play, but we don't run a lot of things that need to be on the battlefield first before we start playing our landfall cards. This deck much more would rather just try to make sure that its hands full and just keep dumping lands on the battlefield, so that way when we Root Awakening or Sylvan Awakening, we really stick it to our opponents. We don't want to like try to play a 3-drop before we play our ramp spell, then try to sequence our ramp spells later. Then it's like, crap, I'd rather play this landfall card first with this other one so I get extra. No, we just want to dump our hand, spend our tons of mana that we have to draw more cards, to dump more lands, and then we just run over our opponents. Very similarly, Roaring Earth, 1 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you put a 1/1 counter on target creature or vehicle you control. So obviously the same thing. It also has a channel ability that you can pay X green green to discard it from your hand to put X11 counters on target land you control, and it becomes a 0/0 spirit creature with haste. It's still a land. Obviously, we're mostly playing this for the first mode, be able to consistently augment our commander's power. But in like a really bad fail case, we can kind of ambush somebody out of nowhere by tapping a ton of mana to turn one of our lands into a giant creature. But yeah, just some consistency, making sure we can augment Yoti's power without having to have quite as much setup as we would want with an overrun effect. These we can just kind of cast when we have extra mana lying around to start building up our commander and make it a huge threat. And once again, if our commander dies, it's really not even the end of the world, because if we cast it again, we just get more land creatures, which is awesome. Now, moving into the next category, we're going to get into kind of what the core deck experience is. We are mostly looking to put lands into play. A lot of the broken land cards that let you play extra lands are generally pretty expensive cards. So I've opted for a lot of creatures that tap to put lands into play consistently. What this allows us to, the main downside to these compared to the more broken landfall cards is obviously we have to have the lands in our hand. And it's hard to fuel cards like these because very quickly you can run out of lands in your hand to play. So what we've decided to do with this deck is add tons and tons of card draw. That way we can start dumping our hand, dumping all these lands into play. Then we can refuel and then continue dumping. So we have lots and lots of card draw. The best ones are the ones that draw and ramp. That way they don't really require us to already have the other little guys out that tap to put lands into play. They kind of do double duty. These are typically a little bit more mana intensive, but as hopefully we'll illustrate, we're going to have a lot of lands lying around to be able to cast these. These are kind of the highlights of the deck. These are really the glue that keeps the deck together. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of these. Eureka Moment, Urban Evolution, and Gretchen Twitch Willow are the best ones. Eureka Moment is 2 green and a blue for an instant. Draw 2 cards. You may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. So, not the most card draw for the mana that you can get, but it's just really good consistency. Urban Evolution is 3 green and a blue for a sorcery. Draw 3 cards. You may play an additional land this turn. Excellent, as we've just stated. That's exactly what we're looking for. And Gretchen Twitch Willow is blue and a green for a 0/4 Halfling Druid legend. It has an activated ability of 2 green and a blue. Draw a card. You may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. A mini Thrasios, if you will, but much more affordable at like a quarter. But yeah, this one is very, very consistent. While it's not as immediately effective as Eureka Moment and Urban Evolution, it's its own engine that does everything that we want. So excellent. And then lastly, to kind of fill out our card draw, we have 2 more things. We have big extra spells. We got a lot of them. I put 5 in the deck. And my reasoning for this is I basically always want to draw 1 fairly quickly. And most of the time, you're going to want to cast 2 in a game. That's how much card draw we're looking for. We're really looking to draw a lot of cards, make sure we always hit all of our land drops, and have extra lands to spare to put into play. As far as which extra spells, it's not. These are just the ones that are the most efficient. These are almost all 2 blue and X. So that's what we're mostly looking for. The extra effects on draw X spells are not as important to us. We mostly just want the ones that are efficient so we can draw more cards. And then we have a few extra card draw specific cards. Some that are a little less reliable, but are very cheap on mana costs, like Explore, Growth Spiral, Coiling Oracle, Planar Genesis, and Joint Exploration. These are just to kind of help us smooth to get to those 4 and 5 drop cards that we really want to cast to draw a bunch of cards and then put lands into play. And then also those will ramp us up into our big extra spells that will really make sure that we don't run out of things to do. And then we have just a few more dedicated card draw cards and a few more land ramp cards that are pseudo card draw. Normally I don't really like the Cultivates, the Nissa's Pilgrimage, and then Journey to Discovery as well. But in this specific deck, the lands in hand with our tappers that can put lands into play and our additional land players, these act as kind of like sort of pseudo card draw tutors, because most of the time when we're drawing cards, we want to draw lands so that way we can keep our game plan going. So these kind of act as pseudo card draw while also, putting more lands into play more quickly, which is what we are looking for. So normally I don't play these cards nowadays, but they're perfect for this deck. We can afford to be a little inefficient for the consistency. Lastly, we have a few dedicated card draw, more traditional card draw, in Deep Analysis and Brain Surge. These give us access to a lot of cards consistently. In Deep Analysis case, it's 4 mana to draw 2, but then you can flash it back for 2 mana and 3 life. So effectively, this card represents 4 cards. And then Brain Surge is 2 and a blue for an instant. Draw 4 cards, and then you put 2 cards from your hand back on top of your library, which we do run a few of the budget fetches, if you want to call them that, like Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse and such. But more importantly, I've actually just been pretty high on Brain Surge. I just think about it as a divination that lets you look at 2 extra cards. And that's kind of what has sold me on the card. Because 3 mana draw 2 is not impressive, but it's something that you can live with. If you have to evoke a Mole Drifter, you have to evoke a Mole Drifter, right? But Brain Surge is just kind of that, but like supercharged, even though it kind of just seems like you're drawing 1 more card than Brainstorm for 2 extra mana, which doesn't sound like a great deal, right? But that is just rate, right? You're going 3 mana to draw 2 cards. That's just what you'd expect. And this just gives you a lot more options than that. So I am a big fan of Brain Surge. All right, so let's move into the next category, where we do want to run some Landfall stuff. Like I said, we're not a Landfall deck, and a lot of the cards that are like Landfall based are generally pretty expensive in terms of like money. So working with a $25 budget, I can't really afford a few of them that I might like. But there are a few that are plenty powerful enough, and we're putting so many lands into play that they are definitely useful, especially if they draw cards like Tatiova Benthic Druid. I probably don't need to read this one for you, but I will. It's 3 green and a blue for a 3/3 legendary creature, Merfolk Druid. Whenever land enters the battlefield under you control, you gain a life and draw a card. That's perfect. That's exactly what we're looking for. Tireless Tracker is similar. 2 and a green for a 3/2 landfall. You investigate, which means you make a clue. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, it gets a 1/1 counter. So this one, even though it requires you to put in mana to convert the lands you play into card draw, still that's exactly what we're looking for. Rampaging Balos, classic. 4 green for a beast, 6/6 with trample. Landfall, you make a 4/4 beast. This can be kind of like a backup win condition for us if we aren't really able to get our Rude Awakening thing going. This can just build an army of 4/4 beasts pretty quick, and then if we just overrun those can kill a player or maybe 2. And then lastly, Tireless Provisioner, 2 and a green for a 3/2 landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, you make a food or a treasure token. I'm sure that like the ratio of making food to treasure is like 99 to 1 with this card. But yeah, it's essentially a Lotus Cobra that you can like bank on. But having the food there is nice. I guess if you're taking a beating, having a few outlets in your deck to gain life is certainly good. So like I said, these are really the only landfall payoffs that we have in the deck besides the ones that we mentioned earlier that augment our commander's power. But these are just powerful enough and just offer us, so much utility that they're worth running, even though we aren't a dedicated landfall deck. Most of these, the 3 mana ones, Tireless Tracker and Tireless Provisioner, are pretty easy to get down and then play our landfall cards afterwards. It's not really that awkward. And then Tatiova and Rampaging Balos are just really powerful for what we're doing, so we can definitely flex those in. Now, as far as board wipes for this deck, board wipes in blue and green on a budget, yeah, it's a little tough. I found 2 that I quite liked for this deck that go with our theme, but you can't really afford a Cyclonic Rift, and all the other blue board wipes that are like good in 2 color are just, there's not really that many. But these are 2 that I'm going to be pretty impressed with for this deck. Consuming Tide is 2 blue for a sorcery. Each player chooses a non-land permanent they control. Return all non-land permanents not chosen this way to their owner's hands. Then you draw a card for each opponent who has more cards in their hand than you. Generally, that last effect actually triggers. You usually get a card or 2 with that. But also, very importantly, you see that it says non-land. So our land creatures that are out there will be able to stay in play, which is excellent. That's a very good way to clear the way for our land creatures to get in. And we get to keep one thing on the board, so we could keep Yoti on the board after we've maybe pumped him or something. And then we can slam in with all of our land creatures pretty unimpeded, which is awesome. And generally, we don't have a lot of permanents lying around on the battlefield. That's kind of the nice thing about the spells sort of mana ramping that we're doing, is that unlike like the explorations and the all of those sort of cards, those will get bounced to our hand with a card like this. While even though we're being less efficient with the ramp that we have, it doesn't. It's much more sticky to the battlefield. So Consuming Tide works great with that, and for only 4 mana, that's definitely a board wipe that we can work with. Flooded Tears, very similar. It's 4 blue for a sorcery. Return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands, right? That's what we're looking for. If you return 4 more non-token permanents you control this way, you may put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield, which is awesome. This means most of the time when we pick up our stuff, we're going to be able to put our commander back down and do essentially the same song and dance with Consuming Tide. But Flood of Tears doesn't even let them keep anything, so that's pretty awesome. So I was able to find these 2 board wipes that I felt pretty good about that work with our strategy. They don't bounce our land creatures. They help clear the way for our land creatures. All makes sense to me for sure. We got a bit more ramp in this deck that's going to kind of round out our ramp package. Secure Tribe Elder, Spring Bloom Druid, Wood Elves, Rampant Growth, Harrow, Nature's Lore. These are all very standard stock ramp spells, all very good. Some of them put extra lands into play. There's a few of them that are creatures that are bodies that can sit and play and chump block or whatever. So yeah, these are just a few extra ramp cards to kind of round out the deck. And now we get into the elephant in the room, as we do in all of our videos. Let's talk about Soul Ring. So I'm not a fan of Soul Ring in Casual Commander. It's fast mana. We generally talk down about fast mana in Casual Commander. People don't like mana crypts, Mox, and all that stuff. People think that people that play those are sweaty, but we play Soul Ring in all of our casual decks, which is arguably better than almost all of those, if not better than all of those. So my suggestion to you is, if you are looking to play Casual Commander, that you talk to your play group and you guys cut Soul Rings from your decks. Trust me, it'll lead to a lot more meaningful games where somebody doesn't run away with the game and leads to non-games and all of that sort of stuff. But for me, making a deck for you, I'm expecting that most people that are looking to build this deck are going to go out to the masses and play it at their local game store and stuff, which is my goal. I want you to be able to take this deck and compete at your local game store on a very cheap budget with some unique cards that people don't often play. But Soul Ring has to be a card that I suggest to you for that reason. So I've stretched it to make it into the budget, and it's so powerful that there's no way that you shouldn't include it if you're trying to, optimize a deck. But for play, fun experience, and for the casual format at large, I would suggest that you talk to people and not play Soul Ring in your casual decks. There you go. That's my spiel. All right. Let's talk about a few more utility cards that I've thrown in the deck. I have Titania, Protector of Argoth, Timeless Witness, and Sylvan Advocate. These kind of reinforce some of our strategies. So Titania, Protector of Argoth, 3 green for a 5/3 elemental. When she enters the battlefield, return target land from your graveyard to the battlefield. We will have lands going to our graveyard. We have some fetch lands, and we have like Harrows, Spring Bloom Druids, things like that. And also, whenever our Dryad land creature token that our commander makes dies, it's going to trigger this second ability, which is whenever a land you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you create a 5/3 green elemental creature token, which is excellent. Would you like to block my 1/1? Okay, I get a 5/3 then. It just becomes a huge threat on the board. You're representing anytime you play a fetch land or anything that you can just start cranking out 5/3s, which we're not playing the usual combo cards with Titania like Zerd Orb and stuff. They just don't really do anything in this deck without Titania out, so just not worth running. We're not running tutors to go like get either this or a card that would combo with it, so obviously I'm not doing that. But just like generically powerful, this is just plenty generically powerful to run for this deck. Timeless Witness, 2 green for a 2/1 human shaman. When it enters the battlefield, you can return a card from your graveyard to your hand, and has Eternalized for 5 green, which means you can bring it back from your graveyard as a 4/4. This is kind of my concession to, I didn't quite want to run another X-Draw spell. I didn't quite want to run another Overrun spell. I didn't quite want to run another make all your lands into creatures do into dudes, because all of those effects are like, they can like clog up your hand a little bit if you draw one too many of them or something. So Timeless Witness is kind of here to stand in where those sort of cards, you can fire them off a little bit more willingly in the way that I have the deck built, because you're going to draw so many cards that you're eventually going to see this card or another version of the card that you're looking for. So for consistency's sake, I feel like Timeless Witness is kind of some glue that helps hold this deck together with some of the more situational cards that are in the deck. Sylvan Advocate is 1 in a green for a 2/3 with Vigilance. As long as you control 6 or more lands, it and land creatures you control get +2/+2. That's excellent. Obviously, we want to pump our land creatures. As you can tell, these sort of buffs add up very quickly, especially once we start adding trample to the mix, or especially once we have 15 lands in play on like turn 6 and we turn them all into 2/2s, which is very possible with this deck. So these are a few more glue cards I decided to add. Now, we're going to get into a few more interaction cards. We don't have a lot of dedicated interaction in this deck. I think that's just a concession that we have to make to do our game plan. Blue and green is not the best at answering things that are on the battlefield. But there was a few spots that I felt good about with Resculpt, Reality Shift, and Reclamation Sage. These are all very efficient ways to get rid of our opponent's things for good. And they work pretty well with our strategy, not committing too much to the board and such. So I felt like these were good enough. Well, we're mostly going to have to rely on dumping our hand, using our mana advantage to just draw a bunch of cards and then get into one of our board wipes or something if things really become a problem. But this is just one of the concessions that the deck has to make. We can't really run a bunch of counter spells or anything. It's just way too awkward and inefficient with what we're trying to do. So this is kind of where I had to land with the interaction. It can be proactive or reactive interaction. All right, lastly, we run a ton of lands in this deck. I've decided on 44 lands, and I am dead serious. You should not cut any lands from this deck. You really need that many lands. And a lot of them are enter untapped, which is very important as well. So I didn't have a lot of room for utility lands, but I found a few that I did like in Sunken Palace and Opal Palace, double palaces somehow. Sunken Palace is a new land. It enters the battlefield tapped. It taps for a blue mana. You can pay 1 blue, tap the Sunken Palace, exile 7 cards from your graveyard. You get a blue mana. And whenever you spend this mana to cast a spell or activate an ability, you may copy it and you may choose new targets for the copy. So this can double. This is obviously not the most mana efficient. You essentially use 3 mana to get 1 mana, and you have to exile 7 cards from your graveyard. But there's a lot of times in this deck where if you just cast 1 spell off of this thing, that it's going to just end the game very easily. So Sunken Palace seems like it's definitely a powerful enough utility land. I'm really surprised it's on a budget, to be honest with you. But yeah, it's a very powerful land, very scary land for your opponents. And then Opal Palace is normally a land that I hate, that I think is just terrible, but it actually works in this deck. It taps for a colorless mana, or you can pay 1 and tap it. Add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity. If you spend this mana to cast your commander, it enters the battlefield with a number of additional 1/1 counters on it, equal to the number of times it's been cast from the command zone this game, which is actually kind of sweet, because we want to augment our commander's power, because it, increasingly makes our land creatures bigger. And if it already kind of works with our commander, because our commander doesn't mind dying, because then we get more land creatures. So then it makes the extra land creatures even bigger. So it's just got some pretty cool synergy in this deck, and we can afford a few colorless lands, and this one enters untapped. So even though I normally think this card is just terrible, because it's way too useless, and nowadays, or how powerful utility lands are nowadays, this one actually seems like it makes the cut. It's actually really sweet. So that's essentially what we got the main deck boiled down to. I left out a few small details of flex cards and stuff like that. You'll have to look at the deck list in the description to see the full deck list, but that's essentially the long form version of it. There's a few cards. Let's get into a few small excludes from the deck that I would like to highlight. So this beautiful art that you've been seeing in the background the whole time is Natural Affinity by Pete Venters. Just absolutely stunning art. It's 2 and a green for an instant. Until end of turn, all lands become 2/2 creatures that are still lands. Now this one is not exactly a budget constraint. This card's about like a little over $1 right now. I could have squeezed this into the deck by making a few shifts around. But I think this card is not quite good enough, because these effects, even though this is how we essentially win the game, how we convert our massive amount of card draw and lands on the battlefield into a win, This one doesn't really offer us much and anything more than the other ones do. And I'm not convinced I need more of them. From my playtesting, it seems that that if I added any more of them, that it would definitely clog up my hand and that it would be really awkward. So I'm not convinced that I would even need another one. And this one also turns your opponent's lands into 2/2 creatures. So if they have any untapped mana, they just get free blockers if you threaten them with tons of damage. So yeah, this one's definitely the worst one of the ones that we have looked at for this deck, and I'm not convinced that I even need another one for this deck. Like I said earlier, this is kind of where Timeless Witness plays an important role in the deck, where it kind of acts as another turn all my lands into creatures in a pinch. By if I played one earlier and it didn't quite do the job, didn't quite kill anybody, then it's like, crap, I only got like two more of those in my deck. It's like, well, here's where Timeless Witness comes in handy, and you can get that one back that you just used to redo it and try again rather than trying to hope that you draw into another one. Because if you have two of these things sitting in your hand at the same time, it's kind of disastrous. So I don't quite think that this one is good enough. And down the road, if they release more of this effect, I would say that it would probably have to be better than one of the ones in the deck before you would add it into the deck, unless it has a modal version, obviously, where it's like you can draw cards or like turn all your dudes into your lands into dudes or whatever. Then obviously that would be one that I would consider. But this one didn't quite make the cut, as beautiful of the card as it is. We have a few more utility lands I'd like to highlight. These were a little bit out of the budget price range, but are some examples of some of the utility lands that I would add into the deck. Horizon of Progress and Terrain Generator. The important thing with these cards is that you can pay some amount of mana and tap them to put lands from your hand into play, which, as I've demonstrated with some of the creatures that we're running, is a very important aspect of this deck. We generally want to have one or two of these effects every game fairly early, so being able to kind of free roll one on a land is pretty nice. So there's plenty of other utility lands that you could run. I have a pretty old video now where I highlight some utility lands that I quite like if you'd like to go see what I think of some of them, but it's pretty outdated now with the like large swath of utility lands that we've gotten that are just insane. That these are some of the highlights that are fairly affordable that you could splash in here fairly easily for some of like the like bad man lands or something. So wanted to highlight those to keep them on your mind. There are a few things that can make lots of land creatures, where it's a Shia that turns all your lands into forests, or Awaken the Woods that makes a bunch more of those 1/1 Greed Forest Dryad land creature tokens. There's not any of them that are on a budget right now that are worth running. These are the two that I would highlight as ones that I would go to, or as examples of cards that I would look for in the future for this deck. But they're just too expensive, but these are definitely very powerful cards, obviously, for this deck that fit perfectly with what we're doing. And then lastly, the broken land stuff that I sort of talked about, like burgeoning and exploration, the really hyper efficient cards that let you put lots of lands from your hand into play. My suggestion is if you start running very many of these, you're just better off building a different deck than this, because your deck's just going to very quickly outscale what this one is trying to accomplish. Where you should just like swap Tatiova or something into your command zone and just build a land stack like everybody else has. But you know, this isn't necessarily a landfall deck, so this deck's a bit unique in that way, with the way it's trying to win and trying to convert its strategy into a little bit more of like a spell slingery sort of different strategy. So if you just want to build like a land stack, I would just suggest you go do that. But I guess if you have an exploration or burgeoning line around, sure, you could throw it in place of one of the dudes that tap to put a land from your hand into play, because obviously those are just dudes, so they can die to stuff and they're a little bit worse. But yeah, if these are not budget friendly, obviously, probably never will be. The closest we've gotten on either of these is like $5, so that obviously would be way too hard to fit into the budget. But yeah, this is a deck that's kind of more focused on being casual and fun and different. That's the decks that I try to build here. So if you're playing just these generically extremely powerful broken landfall cards like these, then I would suggest that you just build your average Tatiova deck or whatever. Anyway, I'm Blake. I'm the Highlander hipster. Hope you enjoyed this deck tech. I got plenty more coming, like I said, with Bloomburrow. Check out some of my other ones that I've previously done. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, reach out to me in the comments. Take care, everybody. Peace.